If it got wet, not going to fire. Okay, so it was very important. Okay, so I talked about the tomahawk. This is a tomahawk. They would throw these. Okay, the Indians used them a lot too. That's where we got them from, the Indians. Obviously, the Indians used them. So, and you guys have all seen the movie The Patriot, right? You guys all seen that movie, and they use that a lot in there, right? Okay. All right. So that's about weapons. Now, they didn't have money, so to speak. Well, they did have money, okay? But the U.S. didn't have money there. It's some British money. But for the most part, the Spanish dollar was the currency of the time. It was like a silver dollar. You guys know what a silver dollar is? Yeah, well, this was a Spanish dollar. And it was kind of the currency of the time. And the pirates, you guys have all heard about pirates, right? Yeah, well, they call it pieces of 8, right? You all heard of pieces of 8? Yeah, pieces of 8 in the treasure, right? Well, silver, these were made of silver. And it was valued by weight, okay? So they would trade these things, but they didn't have smaller dollars and stuff, so sometimes they would cut them in half, okay? Or sometimes they'd cut them in 4 pieces, right? So what they called them, and they would eventually cut them into 8 pieces, all the way down to 8 pieces. So that's pieces of 8, right? So each piece was called a bit. How many of you guys have grandpas or great-grandpas and you've heard them say 2 bits, 4 bits, $1? You ever heard that before? 2 bits, 4 bits, 8 bits, $1? Well, that's where the expression comes from, because they would cut the Spanish dollar into 8 bits. So 8 bits is worth, well, let's put it this way. If I got 8 bits and I cut it in half, what are these? How much is 1 bit? How much is one of these? If a whole one is 8 bits, how much is half? 4 bits. If I cut them in 4 pieces, how many is one of these? 2 bits. And then if I cut them in 8 pieces, is 1 bit. So that's how they come up with bits. Okay, and that's what it was done. The Continental U.S. Congress, when they met, decided they needed script, so they started backing it, so they issued script money. And they made up their own money, and they wrote it all on here. This was all handmade and then printed. Okay, they printed them all. This is a $20 script, okay? And then sometimes later on, the colonies started printing their own money. Here's some samples of some money, you know, Connecticut or New Jersey, whatever colony from would print their own money sometimes, okay, and document. But the British didn't recognize that, but it was used for trade. So at this time, and we'll get your questions later. Who's up? Brian? Compatriot Brian's going to talk to you about the drums and what the sounds were and what the music was, okay?
Good morning, everybody. How many of you guys think that I was a redcoat when I first walked in? Yeah, I thought so. Well, I'll tell you about that in a minute. All through the centuries, people have been using stuff to signal, to talk to each other from a long way away. Now, they started using drums a long time before the Revolutionary War. About 400 years before the Revolutionary War, they started using the drum and a fife or a whistle in the mountains around the Swiss area. So the drum was the main way to communicate, because there was no telegraph, telephone, no nothing. So this is the way they communicated, by sound, by a whistle, a drum, a trumpet, something like that. Now, the musicians that you see in the movies, they're usually little kids, and that's primarily true. They're usually younger than 16, or they were older men that couldn't fight, like an infantryman, over 50. So a lot of the drummers and fifes were little kids, not older than you. So they were on the battlefield right next to the infantry. And war is war, and when you're going to take out the enemy, you're going to take out the communications first. So the general cannot talk to the infantry or whoever. And that's what happened most of the time. The drummers and the fifers were the first to go. So, yeah.
There were no radios.
There was no radio to tell them anything. They had to use the drum. So, okay, let me see here. Okay, so now there's several different drummers. There is a first, a second, and the third drummer, and a fife. The first drummer would have pretty much like I'm dressed, but he would have a feather in his hat, and that told the general that he's the main drummer, and he would be backed by the commander, out of range of all the enemy, so he could relay his command to the next drummer. Now the next drummer would have either a feather in his hat or another colored cockade, or this little ribbon on my hat. He would have something like that. I'm known as a third drummer. I'm just a plain hat with a red coat. My coat is red because I'm opposite colors of the infantry. Now the white here shows that I'm with the infantry, but the reverse colors shows that I'm the musician and I'm not to be shot at, but they shot at us anyway. So I would be up nearer to the line of fire, so when I hear the drum call come from behind, I would relay it to the next line of people. Okay, now there's several different calls that they have. You've all heard of taps? When they go to, that's when they go to sleep. There's the general, there's assembly, march, several different ones. There's one called parlay. That's when they're fighting and they just start playing parlay. That's when they want to stop. They're tired. They want to stop, or they want to surrender. So that's how they fought back then. They didn't fight at nighttime. They fought during the day. They woke up in the morning, fought during the day, and when it got to be about 5 o'clock, everybody quit, went home, had dinner, and then the next day they got up and fought again. So when you heard parlay, that means it's time to either retreat or, you know, somebody wanted to quit and talk. Okay, now when they got back to camp, it's the same thing. You got different commands to tell them when to cook, when to eat, when to go get wood, when to go get water, and one of the commands. This guy right here in the green, he likes this one. It's time to go to eat. It's called roast beef. That's what it's called, and that's everybody knew that. That's when it was time to go eat. Okay, now when everybody's in camp, there's different times of the day when they would have the drummers could drum. They couldn't just drum anytime they wanted to. They only had certain times of the day, because if you just start drumming, everybody's going to jump up and go, "What's going on?" So they only had certain times of the day when they could drum and practice. And they had to practice 4 times a day. And that was the responsibility of the drum major. You've all seen like the high school with the bands and the guy in the front with the big, he's the drum major. Okay, that's a leftover from the Revolutionary War. That was from the militia. The militia in the beginning of the war was responsible for having the drum and doing all the commands, and that was their responsibility. So where am I? So okay, when they were in the camp, so when they only had a certain time of day to drum. Whenever they would drum, the next regiment or the next company, they would hear what they were playing, and then they would start playing. And they would start playing, and then they would start playing. And then everybody would start playing the same thing. So if it was time to eat, this guy would start playing, and then they would all start playing, and everybody knew what to do. Okay, now, drum and fife were considered non-combatants. They didn't carry any weapons, but they were up by the line anyway, and they took casualties massively. So that's why I have a red cover. Okay, now, one of the battles that Arnie mentioned was the Battle of Trenton, when they captured a whole bunch of German soldiers. Well, in that battle, during the war, at the beginning of the war, they were short of drums and fifes. They were really short of everything. In that battle, they captured 2 full bands of drum and fife. Yes, and so now we have a bunch of extra fifes and drums to use. They took all their musical instruments from them and took them for our own and used them. Another battle was the Battle of Bunker Hill. The drummer used his drum at that battle, and at the end of the war, he turned his drum in to the commander. That commander kept the drum in that company until the War of 1812, the next war. And they used that drum again in that war. And that drum can be seen today in the Bostonian Society in Boston. It still survives. Now we've all heard of Paul Revere, right? The British are coming. Okay, well, no one's going to listen to somebody running around, the British are coming. They're only going to, the militia's going to hear the drum call. So now, after Paul Revere did his ride, it fell on one person to drum the call to arms. William Diamond was his name. John Parker's Lexington Militia. And he was only 15 years old. He drummed the first call to arms. So there you have it. They weren't much older than you guys. Now this drum is the size that they used in the French and Indian War and in the Revolution. And now when they packed up their stuff and they had to move the army, everybody would put their stuff on a wagon or carry it, but the drummers were not allowed to put their drums on the wagon. If they did, they were flogged or whipped. So the drummer had to carry it everywhere. That's what this rope is for. It's called a drag rope, and that's how they carried their drum. That's all I got. That's good. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. I'm dressed different. What am I? You know that as Continental Army. I'm a Continental Marine.
Ooh, Continental Marine.
We have some people on the land who are fighters. Continental Navy. What about them? They needed protection. All they could do was sail a ship. They needed somebody that could protect them. Hence, Continental Marine formed. November 10th, 1775. We became official. The first thing we had to do was get on board ship. Anybody know what a frigate is? Frigate? You know what a pirate ship is? You know what a frigate is?
Okay.
We'll get to you for this question and answer. Okay. Our first duty as a Marine, we went to the Bahamas. Why did we go to the Bahamas? Because the British had a fort down there that had a whole bunch of powder, rifles. We desperately needed for our cause. So we went back down to the Bahamas, captured all this stuff, took it back to Boston, turned it over to the Continental Army. At that point, we were disbanded and supplied with Continental Army. And a few of the lucky ones got to stay on ships to go to England, where they did come to their age. And when the war So, where did the color uniform come from? Why were we different? Well, there was a shortage of cloth. However, in Philadelphia, they had a whole bunch of green cloth and white cloth. And our uniform, the hat, the commander of the Marines at the time was also in the civilian line. He was a owner of a hunting club. The hat comes from the uniform of the club. And the hat and the weapons. The stacks. The old-time stacks. What were they used? Okay. You will notice some of the Army uniforms. What was the length of that? For the Marines, when we were on board ship, we did not wear these. When we were on land, we wore them. That's basically what we did. We helped the Navy, we helped the Army. And I will turn it over to our leaders.
I appreciate it if the teacher would sort of relay the question up to us. As we age, we have hard of hearing, and I know that a lot of the students didn't have hearing aids in those days. But even with hearing aids, we have difficulty sometimes picking up because of the other sounds around. So if the teacher will sort of relay the question up, then we'll try to answer the best. One of the four of us will try to answer that question.
You're up, ladies. Your turn now.
Why do you have to use swords?
Why do you have to use swords? Well, you only had really two. You had a rifle, you had a sword, or you had a pistol or a tomahawk. Those were the weapons. Now we're talking, this is a war. Like the Revolutionary War meant that people were going to die. And it seems gruesome, but that's reality. And the sword, that because the bullets or the round musket would shoot the round ball, they were not accurate. And so the sword ended up being, if you charged somebody and you had a sword, you do some damage. If you're going to, musket, you have to sit there and load. You can imagine you're sitting there trying to load this musket, put the ball in, all that. By then you're run over. So the sword came into play. Anything else want to add on that?
Well, remember, guys, I mentioned that they lined up about 100 yards apart and they would fire their muskets, but after about 5 minutes of firing and reloading 3 or 4 times a minute, the muskets were fouled and then they put the bayonet on. Well, the rank and file infantrymen use those. The NCOs, which this is an NCO, I'm a sergeant with this lapel epaulet here, and the band here, I'm a sergeant. Okay, so NCOs would have swords, officers would have swords, or if they're in cavalry, they'd have sabers. So hand-to-hand combat, when they would have to charge after the weapons and they couldn't engage and they charge each other, more of the soldiers died in hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and swords than all together with shooting from the muskets.
Okay. Any other
for hand-to-hand combat?
We got a question back there.
The question is to the drummer, how do you go from being the third-ranked drummer to being the first-ranked drummer so you're not in the front lines?
How do you go from
How do you go from being the lowest-ranked drummer to being...
Well, I'm not considered a low rank.
Okay.
All the drummers are pretty much the same. They're like a private.
Okay.
They're ranked at about a private. They're paid a little bit more than a private because they have to take care of the drum. But the first drummer is mainly, we would say, like the person that teaches the rest of the drummers how to drum.
Okay, so the more experienced you were...
I guess you would say that,
Okay, so if you were starting out as a young kid being the drummer, you'd be the third-ranked drummer and you'd be on the front line.
And up to
So the more experience and the better practice in the,
Right.
you would become a first rank. You are concerned concern was we didn't want to be on the front line as a drummer. We
Right.
wanted to be one with
Right, yeah, the more experienced drummers would be in the back and they would save hymns because they needed to teach the next people how to.
The A students got to be next in the back. The F students were in the front.
It's you in the back.
Guys, it's just like business. Any business, you know, when you first start, you're the low man on the totem pole, so you're going to do all the grunt work, and the boss is going to sit in the back in his office and watch you work, right?
We have some questions over here. Wait, we have questions. We have some questions over here.
Yes, Ramiro would like to know, did the colonists make their own weapons or did they get them from overseas?
Actually, what happened was a lot of them were made by the French. This is a 1777 French charbel. They also made them in 1775. This is a flintlock. Before that, they had matchlocks, blunderbuss, and all this. But a lot of them were made from British. The British had what was known as the Brown Bess, and that was the big weapon of the time for the British. But the U.S. would get a lot of this from the French. That Victor Arnie had talked about how we got support from Dutch and French and all this. They shipped them to us. We bought them from them. The French were a big supplier of arms for us, okay? But when we raided the British, like with the drums that Victor Brian was talking about, we would also steal their weapons and take their weapons. So a lot of the weapons were obtained by taking over and capturing the army and capturing their weapons.
Our weapons and the British weapons were almost identical. Okay, another question.
Robert would like to know what is the horn that you're wearing, what is that used for?
This is a powder horn. This is what stores the gunpowder that we put in here. These are pre-measured little, no, they're little measured cups, thank you, that you would pour into here. So they're pre-measured, so I would pour the right amount of powder in the musket. Because if I didn't pour enough, I could get a misfire. If I poured too much, I could have a misfire, or it could blow the weapon up.
Okay, another question over here.
Marcus would like to know how you guys found your food while you were battling.
Well, there was a quartermaster that supplied, you said food?
Food, yeah.
What was quartermaster was people in the background that supplied some of the food, and they would give it into rations, and they would ration it out. You would have it in here, but they would dry the meat. We didn't, again, there's no refrigerators or anything, so a lot of things were dried or salted, and they would have like beef jerky or fish jerky, and they would carry it to haversack, and they would munch on that, and then when they got to that night, a bunch of them would gather together and build a fire. Everything had to be done by open fire pits, and they'd build a fire and they would cook their food, and they were issued some flour and stuff, but they also picked berries as we would go along or kill a squirrel.
Remember that the colonies were occupied long before we decided to fight for independence. So people were living here on plantations and farms. So some of our ancestors weren't necessarily fighters in the Revolutionary War, but we were involved in the Revolutionary War by supplying goods and supplies. And some of it was beef and cattle. The quartermasters would take the monies that were issued by the Continental Army as scrip or dollars, and they would go out to these plantations and purchase and buy those goods and bring them back to the camps.
We're going to right here.
Alex, I would like to know how you printed money without electricity.
Oh, it was a hand press. There was every little letter was individually cut out of steel, of metal or bronze that was shaped, and they would rack them out individually, and then they would put a piece of paper down, and then they had a big wheel, and they would turn the wheel, and it would come down and push, and it was ink. It would push down, and that would create either the newspaper or the book page or the money. It was an extremely slow process, but it was all done by hand. And Ben Franklin was one of the more famous ones that had printing presses, but they were hand-operated printers, no electricity, cranes, wheels, especially in the back.
Nevaeh and Madison have a combined question in regards to your uniforms. Okay, one, where did the Continental Army get their uniforms, and how heavy or uncomfortable are they to wear?
Extremely uncomfortable. They're wool, and a lot of them came from France, but a lot of them were sort of left over from the French and Indian War that was 10 years before the Revolutionary War. George Washington's first coat that he came out of was what he used in the war of the 7-Year War, the Indian War. But they came from Europe, most of them. And we had some start to make them here in the States, people in Philadelphia and so on. But again, if you got caught supporting us, yeah. Okay, over here. We're going to bounce around.
He'd like to know what happened to people if they got shot. Is there a hospital that they went to?
If they were lucky, typically, what, amputation? Amputation was real common. They didn't have like what we see in medicine where they go in and open them and stitch them up, and they would just they'd tape it off with a big tourniquet. And it wasn't pretty.
Remember, back in those days, they didn't know about bacteria and microscopic germs and stuff like that. They didn't know about that stuff. So it was very unsanitary conditions. The doctor would just saw it off. If they didn't do anything, they just saw it off and wrap it up.
There were no bathrooms.
You get gangrene and you die. Even if you have amputated, you might get gangrene and die.
Okay, we got it. Let's go back over here.
She wanted to know about how many swords do they have? Did every soldier have one? Or were they few and far between, or what?
No, the swords again were manufactured by some places in the United States, like Philadelphia. Typically, the officers and the non-commissioned officers carried them. The regular infantrymen did not carry swords.
Okay, back here.
Luke would like to know, can we have a demonstration of the drum calls? Specifically parlay
I
and roast
haven't
beef.
learned drum calls yet.
I was waiting for roast beef.
I know. Well, there's about 9 calls, but the thing was, they didn't write it down. There's no notation for drumming. They have no notation for the pipes, but they have no music for the drums. It was just the person that taught the drummer, he kind of interpreted it himself and said, okay, this is how we're going to play it. And then somebody from another colony would go, oh, well, this is how we're going to play it with this little bit. So it kind of got mixed up a little bit, but there's no written music for the drumming in the Revolutionary War. And it's very difficult, for me anyway, to find that out.
Interesting that. So if you don't write something down, it gets lost along history. Thank you.
Well, this one is, as already said, this one is just to carry little stuff that I needed, some extra clothes or whatever. This bag would usually carry the whip. The whip was to whip somebody that was that needed to be disciplined. The drummer had to carry the whip. So if somebody got out of line, they had to be disciplined. They got flogged, which was a whip. It was a little whip that came out like this, and it just came out with a bunch of little fingers like that. It's called a cat of 9 tails. And that was the drummer's job to carry that.
They were also used as a wallet. Think of this as a wallet or a purse. And you can't get it all in here. Not every. We have a lot of soldiers that carry one animal. It was just an upgrade. He had time. He killed a squirrel, or not a squirrel, maybe a beaver or something, and then he skinned it, and he decided he was going to make another pouch. Everything he had to carry, backpack, cap here, you carried everything with you, and the gun. These rifles, what are 10 pounds?
10 pounds.
10 pounds, the rifle. Then you start adding the tomahawk, and maybe you add the pistol, and that's just a fake pistol. That isn't the weight wise, it's only a pound. That's probably several pounds. Anyway, we got to get going. We got a few more. We got one right here. How they cut the money? Probably some kind of a shear.
Some kind of a shear. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how they would do it, but they probably had some big shears that they would cut them with, like scissors, but only really heavy shears.
Well, like a knife, like taking a knife and then hitting it.